Margaret was 58 years old when she found the letter. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Rain was tapping softly against the windows, and the old house felt colder than usual. Margaret had lived there for almost her entire life. Every corner had a memory. Every room carried a piece of her past. That day, she decided to clean the attic. She did not know why. Maybe because she felt lonely. Maybe because something inside her told her it was time to let go of the things she had been keeping for too long. The attic was full of old boxes, dusty furniture, forgotten photographs, and memories she had not touched in years. Margaret moved slowly, opening one box after another. There were old dresses, books, Christmas decorations, and pictures of people who were no longer alive. Then she saw it. A small wooden box hidden behind an old chair. It was covered with dust, but Margaret recognized it immediately. Her hands began to tremble. It was the box Daniel had given her 30 years ago. Daniel. The name alone made her heart ache. He had been the love of her life. The only man she had ever truly loved. They were young when they met, full of dreams, hope, and promises. Daniel had kind eyes, a warm smile, and a way of making Margaret feel like she was the only woman in the world. They had planned a future together. A small house. A garden. Children. Sunday mornings with coffee. Long walks in the evening. A simple life, but a happy one. But one day, Daniel disappeared. No goodbye. No explanation. No final conversation. He was just gone. Margaret waited for him. One day. 1 week. 1 month. Then years passed. People told her to forget him. He left you, they said. He never loved you enough, others whispered. But Margaret never fully believed that. Deep inside, she always felt there was something she did not know. Still, life moved on. She married another man years later. A kind man named Robert. He treated her well, gave her stability, and stood beside her through difficult times. But Margaret's heart was never completely his. There was always a quiet place inside her that belonged to Daniel. Now, 30 years later, she was standing in the attic, holding the box he had given her. Her fingers touched the old wood gently. She opened it. Inside, there were a few dried flowers, a black and white photograph of them together, and under the photograph a letter. Margaret stopped breathing for a second. The envelope was yellow with age. Her name was written on the front. Margaret. The handwriting was Daniel's. She sat down on an old chair, holding the letter close to her chest. For a moment, she could not open it. She was afraid. Afraid of the truth. Afraid of pain. Afraid that after all these years, the answer would break her again. But then she whispered, "I need to know." She opened the envelope carefully. The paper inside was fragile. Her eyes filled with tears before she even read the first line. "My dearest Margaret," her heart broke at those words. She continued reading. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then maybe life has finally allowed the truth to reach you. I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I had no choice. Your father came to me the night before I disappeared. He told me that if I truly loved you, I would walk away. He said I was not good enough for you. He said I had no money, no future, and nothing to offer. I told him I loved you more than anything in this world. But then he told me something that destroyed me. He said your mother was sick, and that the stress of our relationship was making her worse. He said if I stayed, would be responsible for breaking your family apart. I was young. I was scared. And I believed him. So I left. But Margaret, I never stopped loving you. Not for one day. Not for one moment." Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. Tears rolled down her face. Her father? Her own father had made Daniel leave. She remembered that time clearly. Her mother had been ill, yes. Her family had been under pressure. But no one had ever told her anything about Daniel. She had spent 30 years believing he had abandoned her. 30 years carrying pain that was never meant to be hers. She kept reading. I wrote to you many times. I sent letters every month for the first year. Then every Christmas. Then on your birthday. You never answered. I thought you hated me. I thought your silence was your answer. But even then, I kept one letter. This one. I gave it to your father and begged him to give it to you when the time was right. Maybe he never did. Maybe he never will. But I hope one day you find it. I hope one day you understand that you were loved. You were always loved. Daniel. Margaret pressed the letter against her heart and cried like she had not cried in years. All the anger. All the sadness. All the questions. They came out at once. She had blamed Daniel. She had blamed herself. But the truth was worse. The truth was that two people who loved each other had been separated by fear, pride, and silence. Margaret sat in the attic until the rain stopped. Then she took the letter downstairs. Her father had died many years ago. Her mother too. There was no one left to ask. No one left to blame. Only the truth. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She read the letter again and again. And with every word, Daniel came back to life in her memory. His laugh. His voice. The way he held her hand. The way he looked at her like she was his whole world. The next morning, Margaret made a decision. She would find him. Even if he had forgotten her. Even if he had moved on. Even if he had a family. She needed to know if he was still alive. She opened her old laptop and searched his name. Daniel Whitmore. At first, nothing. Then she found an article from a small-town newspaper. Her hands began to shake again. The article was about a man named Daniel Whitmore, a retired carpenter, who had spent years restoring old houses and helping local families. There was a photo. Older face. Gray hair. But the same eyes. Margaret knew immediately. It was him. Daniel was alive. He lived only 3 hours away. Margaret stared at the screen for a long time. Then she found a phone number connected to his workshop. She picked up the phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then a man answered. Hello? Margaret could not speak. That voice. Older, deeper, but still Daniel. Hello? He said again. Margaret closed her eyes. Daniel? There was silence. A long silence. Then the man's voice became soft. Margaret? She began to cry. Neither of them spoke for a moment. 30 years of silence stood between them. Finally, Daniel whispered, I thought I would never hear your voice again. Margaret wiped her tears. I found your letter. Daniel took a deep breath. I hoped one day you would. They talked for almost 2 hours. They talked about the past. About the years they had lost. About the letters Margaret never received. Daniel had never married. He told her he had tried to move on, but no one ever felt like her. Margaret told him about Robert, her late husband, who had passed away 5 years earlier. She told him Robert had been kind, but that part of her heart had always stayed in the past. Daniel did not ask for anything. He did not make promises. He only said, would you like to have coffee with me someday? Margaret smiled through her tears. Yes, she said. I would. 2 days later, Margaret drove to the small town where Daniel lived. She wore a simple blue dress and carried the letter in her purse. When she arrived at the little CAF, her heart was beating like she was 20 years old again. Then she saw him. Daniel stood near the window, holding a cup of coffee. For a moment, they just looked at each other. 30 years had changed them. Their faces had aged. Their hair had turned gray. Life had left marks on both of them. But the eyes were the same. The love was still there. Daniel walked toward her slowly. "Hello, Margaret," he said. She smiled with tears in her eyes. "Hello, Daniel." He reached for her hand. And when his fingers touched hers, it felt like time had folded in half. They sat together for hours. They did not try to pretend they were young again. They did not ignore the pain. They spoke honestly. About regret. About forgiveness. About the life they could have had. And the life they still had left. At one point, Margaret took the old letter from her purse and placed it on the table. Daniel looked at it quietly. "I'm sorry," he said. Margaret shook her head. "No. We were both victims of someone else's fear." Daniel looked down. "I should have fought harder." Margaret smiled sadly. "And I should have searched harder." Then she reached across the table and touched his hand. "But maybe love does not always return when we want it to." Daniel looked at her. "Maybe it returns when we are finally ready to understand it." From that day on, Margaret and Daniel began seeing each other every week. They walked through parks. They drank coffee. They talked about books, music, memories, and ordinary things. There was no rush. No need to prove anything. Their love was no longer young and wild. It was quiet. Gentle. Deep. The kind of love that had survived silence, distance, and time. One evening, Daniel took Margaret to a small garden behind his house. There was an old wooden bench under an apple tree. He had built it himself. "I always imagined you sitting here," he said. Margaret looked at him. "You did?" Daniel nodded. "For 30 years. Margaret sat beside him. The sun was setting, painting the sky gold. Daniel reached into his pocket and took out a small box. Margaret laughed softly. "Daniel," he smiled. "I'm not asking for the years we lost. I know we can't get them back." He opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring. "I'm only asking for the years we have left." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. For most of her life, she thought love had passed her by. She thought her story had ended long ago. But life had one more chapter waiting for her. She looked at Daniel and whispered, "Yes." A few months later, they were married in a small ceremony. No big crowd. No expensive decorations. Just flowers, soft music, and a few close friends. Margaret wore a simple dress. Daniel cried when he saw her. After the ceremony, he held her hand and said, "You were worth waiting for." Margaret smiled. "And you were worth finding." Years later, people in their town would often see them walking together in the evening. Two older people holding hands like teenagers. Some people smiled when they saw them. Others wondered about their story. But Margaret never cared what people thought. She had learned something important. Sometimes life takes away what we love. Sometimes people make choices that break hearts. Sometimes the truth comes too late. But late does not always mean never. And love, real love, does not always disappear. Sometimes it waits. Quietly. Patiently. Hidden inside an old wooden box. Inside a letter. Inside a heart that never truly let go. And sometimes one letter can change everything.